You've buttoned a shirt thousands of times. If you're a man, the buttons are on the right side. If you're a woman, they're on the left. That split is universal. Walk into any clothing store on earth, and every shirt follows the same rule. No one designed it that way recently. No fashion house decided it. No committee voted on it. The pattern is older than zippers, older than sewing machines, older than department stores. It started in the 1600s for a reason that has nothing to do with gender and everything to do with who was dressing you. Here's the actual logic, and once you see it, you'll realize your shirt is carrying a 400-year-old class marker you never knew was there. Before the 1500s, buttons weren't gendered at all. They weren't even standard. Buttons were expensive, carved from bone, horn, or metal, hand-stitched one at a time. A single carved button could cost as much as a day's wages for a laborer. Most people didn't have buttoned clothing. They used laces, pins, cloth ties, and wraps. Buttons were status symbols, reserved for the wealthy. The earliest buttons appeared in 13th century Europe as decorative ornaments, not functional closures. By the late 1400s, buttons started serving a real purpose, holding doublets and tunics closed. But they were still rare, still expensive, still handmade. When buttons started appearing on European clothing in the late Middle Ages, there was no rule about which side they went on. Tailors placed them wherever was convenient for the specific garment. A man's doublet might have buttons on the right, a woman's gown might have them centered or on the right, or wherever the tailor thought looked best. There was no system. But by the 1600s, two separate clothing cultures were forming, and they had completely different needs. Men, across all classes, dressed themselves, even wealthy men. Buttoning your own shirt meant you needed the buttons where your dominant hand could reach them easily. Most people are right-handed, so men's buttons went on the right side, the side that lets a right-handed person pull the fabric across and fasten it without awkward hand angles. It was ergonomic, it was intuitive, it worked. Women's clothing, at least for the wealthy, was a different system entirely. Wealthy women in the 1600s and 1700s did not dress themselves. They had ladies' maids, servants whose entire job was managing their employer's wardrobe. Getting dressed could take an hour. The clothing was elaborate, corsets laced up the back, layers of petticoats tied at the waist, gowns with dozens of tiny buttons running down the back or along intricate front closures. Some gowns had 40 or 50 buttons. You couldn't reach half of them yourself, even if you tried. The servant stood facing the woman. From the servant's perspective, the buttons needed to be on the opposite side. If the woman's buttons were on the left, the servant, standing opposite, facing her, could fasten them with their right hand in a natural, comfortable motion. It was ergonomic design, but not for the wearer. It was optimized for the person doing the dressing. This wasn't a rule anyone wrote down. There was no royal decree, no guild regulation. It was a tailoring convention that emerged organically because the customers who could afford custom-tailored buttoned gowns were the same customers who had servants. The tailors built the garments for the use case, a servant dressing someone else. The client would never touch the buttons herself, so why design them for her hands? Men's clothing didn't have that pressure. Even wealthy men dressed themselves for most garments. Valets helped with formal wear, tying cravats, fastening cufflinks, adjusting tailcoats. But the basic act of buttoning a shirt or waistcoat was done by the man himself. There was no servant standing opposite him every morning, so the buttons stayed on the right, where his own hands could reach them. And for a long time, that split made perfect sense. It wasn't about gender, it was about class. If you were wealthy enough to have someone dress you, your buttons were on the left. If you dressed yourself, they were on the right. Women's clothing didn't just look expensive, it was physically designed to require help. The button placement itself signaled, this person has servants. Middle-class and working-class women who couldn't afford servants wore simpler clothing with fewer buttons or used other closures entirely. But when they did wear buttoned garments, those garments were often hand-me-downs or cheaper imitations of upper-class styles, which meant the buttons were still on the left, even though no servant would be fastening them. And here's what that tells us about everything else around you. Class distinctions fossilize into everyday standards that outlive their original purpose. The button placement wasn't about male versus female, it was about servant versus self. It encoded who you were in the social hierarchy, not through decoration, but through the basic mechanics of how your clothing worked. That's the pattern hidden in dozens of objects you use. A design starts as a solution to a specific local problem, in this case, ergonomic dressing by a servant. Then it gets locked into the manufacturing system, and long after the original condition vanishes, the design stays, reinterpreted as something else entirely. If you want to see more of these, the hidden logic behind the things you use every single day, subscribe. So why did the standard stick when most women stopped having servants? By the mid-1800s, the Industrial Revolution had arrived. Clothing shifted from custom tailoring to factory production. Sewing machines, invented in the 1850s, could produce garments faster and cheaper than any tailor. A hand tailor took hours. Ready-made clothing became available to the middle class for the first time. But the factories needed templates. They needed standard patterns they could cut and sew at scale. Pattern makers couldn't start from scratch. They copied what already existed. And what already existed were the high-end tailored garments that had been the model of proper clothing for centuries. Men's shirts had right-side buttons. Women's dresses had left-side buttons. That's what the existing garments looked like, so that's what the factories reproduced. The factories didn't ask if it still made sense. They asked, what's the pattern we already have? What's the existing standard we can copy at volume? No one stopped to redesign the button placement for the new use case, women dressing themselves. The servants were disappearing from middle-class households, women were increasingly dressing themselves, but the button placement had already been standardized in the pattern-cutting templates, the factory workflows, the printed catalogs. By the 1870s, companies like Singer were manufacturing thousands of sewing machines a year. Factories in New York, London, and Paris were producing millions of garments annually. The Butterick Publishing Company was selling dress patterns to home sewers across North America, and every single pattern showed buttons on the left for women's garments. By the 1890s, department stores were selling mass-produced women's blouses to millions of customers. Macy's in New York, Harrods in London, Le Bon Marché in Paris. Every single blouse, every shirtwaist, every bodice, buttons on the left. The logic was gone, but the design was permanent. And here's the part most people don't realize. The original reason for this design has completely vanished. Servants dressing wealthy women is not a common practice anymore. But the button placement endures, reinterpreted as a gender marker instead of a class marker. The fossil is still there. You're wearing it. The freeze point came in the 1890s and early 1900s. By then, ready-made clothing had become the norm across Europe and North America. The Sears catalog alone was distributing millions of garments a year. Montgomery Ward, Sears' competitor, was shipping to rural communities across the United States. European manufacturers were exporting ready-made clothing globally. Every factory, every pattern maker, every retailer used the same templates. Men's shirts, buttons right. Women's blouses, buttons left. At that point, roughly 50 million women's garments already existed with left-side buttons across the industrialized world. Changing the standard would have meant scrapping every pattern template in every factory. It would have meant retraining every factory worker who had learned the button placement sequence. It would have meant reprinting every catalog, redrawing every illustration, rewriting every instruction manual for home sewers. The cost was impossible to justify, especially because no one was demanding the change. The new generation of women buying ready-made clothing had no memory why the buttons were on the left. They just knew that's where women's buttons went. It was normal. It was standard. It was what a women's blouse looked like. Switching would have required dismantling an entire industrial system for a problem that no one perceived as a problem. So the design stayed, and every decade after that, it became exponentially harder to change. And that's also why neckties are still standard in formal menswear, even though they serve no function. They started as Croatian military neckwear in the 1600s, a way to hold a collar closed. The French aristocracy adopted the style as a fashion statement. It became a class marker, a signal of refinement and status. Then it fossilized into everyday standards that outlived their original purpose. The shirt you button every morning is carrying a servant's ergonomic logic from 1700. The necktie around your collar is carrying a Croatian soldier's uniform from the same era. You just think of them as normal. Next time you button a shirt, remember, you're following instructions meant for someone else's hands.